Well, go ahead and grab your Bibles and turn with me to Psalm 139. That's the 139th Psalm. And before we jump into the Gospel of Luke for who knows how long, I thought what we'd do is just spend some time here this morning on both the nature and the reality of the person of God and really just who he is. And so while I could list for you multiple reasons for why that is always a good thing to do and a needed thing, and of course a necessary thing, I think A.W. Tozier in his little book entitled The Pursuit of God sums it up quite well. He states that whatever comes to your mind when you think about God is without question the most important thing about you. In fact, one man puts it this way. He said that everything in your life is directly influenced by your knowledge and your understanding of who God is. And so the reality is that the places that you go and the decisions that you make and the relationships that you have, in other words, just the totality of how it is that you choose to live out your life, whether you know it or not, are all governed by who you believe and what you understand God to be or not be. In other words, your thoughts of God will forever determine your life as you live it out before the face of God. And so show me a person who has a low view or a low understanding of the nature and the purposes and the character of God, and I'll show you a person who probably leads a shallow and less purposeful and less joyful, and in the grand scheme of eternity, a less meaningful existence. And on the other hand, show me a person who has a high view and a deep view and a rich view and a profound view of the person of God, and I'll show you a person who's probably living a deep and purposeful and meaningful and significant life, and in the grand scheme of eternity, worship. And so really all I want to do this morning is just attempt to walk through this psalm in an effort to show you how it is that King David here, that is a man who God describes as being a man after God's very own heart, who in the midst of much difficulty and much turmoil actually preaches and counsels himself through some of the difficult things of life. And so my hope and my prayer this morning is that this psalm might do for you what it's done for me. And that is that it might be a simple reminder of who God is, of how he functions, and how it is that he relates to all of us, but especially during those times of much fear and much difficulty and incredible confusion when it seems like the dark things of life will not lift and the hard things of life just seem to keep rolling in. And so in an age where the church just seems to keep running to things like programs and techniques and various systems of self-help, this is a psalm and a kind of biblical approach that I think just sheds light on how to discover that which is truly freeing, and in the long term, which I hope is the heartbeat of any Christian, truly worshipful. And so it's a psalm about the nature and the character of who God is. It's a psalm reflecting on the fact that God is transcendent, that is high and lifted up, and that he's lofty and exalted. And at the same time that he's also immanent. And that is that he's also near and close to each and every one of us. It's a psalm about the fact that God knows all things and that he sees all things and that he searches all things, and that in the midst of whatever the situation or whatever the circumstance might be, he is there. It's a psalm that demonstrates just what it means to be sustained by an infinite God, a God who knows our frame and is mindful that we're but dust. And so it's a psalm that's going to show us what it means to cast ourselves upon a God who is there. And so before we get into it, let's go ahead and read the psalm in its entirety, and then we'll work our way through it. So that's Psalm 139, and I'll begin by reading in verse 1. David writes, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up, and you understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, and are intimately acquainted with all of my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, Yahweh, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high, I cannot attain to it. So where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. And if I lay out my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, and if I dwell in the remotest parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. For you formed my inward parts, and you wove me in my mother's womb. So I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. So how precious are your thoughts to me, O God, and how vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand, and when I awake, I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God, and depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, Yahweh? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost of hatred, for they've become my enemies. So search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. Well, for those of you who like a little bit of structure, there are actually 5 different parts to this psalm. In fact, I could preach 5 sermons on this. I won't do that to you. But each one of those parts centers on a certain attribute or characteristic of the person of God. And so in verses 1 through 6, we've seen what is known as the omniscience of God, which is the truth that God knows all things. In verses 7 through 12, we see the omnipresence of God, which is the idea that God is everywhere, always, which means there's no place at any time where he's not fully and completely present. In verse 13 through 18, we see the omnipotence of God, which is a term used to describe the fact that he is the singular and even controlling reality of all things, that he makes all things and sustains all things, that he is the source, he is the life, he is the designer and creator, and so whatever is because he is. And then verses 19 through 22, we see the justice and therefore the vengeance of God against that which is wicked. We see that he is indeed a God of justice and therefore not one to be trifled with. And then in verses 23 through 24, David's going to close out with some insight into the holiness of God. That God is this reality who is utterly unique unto himself. That he is the standard, he is absolute reality, and so with that, he alone possesses the right to determine truth from error and righteousness from unrighteousness. He is God, but he's a God of holiness, a God who possesses the full right to determine our paths in all of our ways. He is a God of righteousness and therefore worthy of worship. That is a life of worship. A life that reflects his nature and the holiness of his eternal character. And so as we jump into the passage here this morning, what we have to keep at the front of our minds and always at the front of our minds is that we must get who God is right. If we get God wrong and therefore our understanding of who we think that he is wrong, it'll have significant consequences not only on our lives, but in the grand scheme of eternity. For as Tozer implies with his statement, your understanding of God affects everything. It affects your life. It affects your decisions. It affects your marriage and your work. It affects not only who you think that God is, but also who you think that we are. In fact, you can only rightly understand who you are in light of a right understanding of who God is. And so understanding who God is has everything to do with your life and therefore your worship, which is actually the only reason that you've been created. And so as we walk through this psalm this morning, it's of incredible importance that we keep at the forefront of our minds the reality that God has revealed who he is through this psalm so that we might have a right understanding of him, and therefore a right worship of him. And so while this is a psalm that's designed to bring comfort to a weary and even an anxious soul, it is in the first place a psalm of God, which should then be telling you something for how it is that you might find a true comfort. And so just notice how he begins here, starting in verse 1. He states, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." Now, notice the intimacy of this knowledge. It's not just a generic statement about humanity or about Israel, or if we want to apply it to the New Testament, the church, or something like that, but rather it's a statement of personal intimacy, and notice at an individual level. He states, "You have searched me and you have known me." And so the meaning behind the term here for search actually carries the idea of exploration and even examination. In fact, it's a term used to speak of the nation of Israel as they would go out into the various lands to sort of search them out and explore all that was in them. They were on a mission to search and discover and to even uncover. It's even used to speak of a trial or even a cross-examination, for instance, in Deuteronomy 13 and verse 14, for the purpose of establishing the true nature of any given matter. And so it speaks of an intimacy of knowledge. In other words, we're not talking about mere guesses. There's no filling in the gaps or resting on mere assumptions on the part of God. And so since God is an infinite reality, the point is that you and I are in the state of having been searched out. That is to say that we are known and completely exposed. And so all of those hidden thoughts and plans and secrets of the heart that you'd never let slip out to even your closest of confidant, the reality is God has found them. He knows your fears. He knows your dreams. He knows your thoughts and the very desires of your heart. And the reality is that he knows them, but that he knows them even better than you. For as it states in Hebrews chapter 4, he knows even the very intentions of your thoughts, something which you and I could never discern. In other words, he knows the very stuff from which your thoughts and dreams and desires are even formed. And so not only does he know them, but the term here carries the idea of understanding. And so it's not that he's just aware of them or has a basic knowledge of them, but that he actually understands them. He knows the why behind your thoughts and desires. And so despite our constant desire and constant bent to just sort of hide and hedge and pretend like we're something other than we really are, as Adam and Eve were known and then exposed in the garden in the midst of their attempts to flee, so also God knows the very essence of what we are. And why is that? Well, because he's a God who has searched us. He sees us. He's examined us. He's intimately acquainted with the stuff that shapes and molds and drives all of our desires. He is a God who quite simply knows. In fact, notice the expansiveness of this knowledge starting here in verse 2. He just states, "And you know when I sit down and when I rise up, and you understand my thought or my intentions and motivations from afar." In other words, you know all of my physical realities, but at the same time, all of my mental and even intellectual realities that are controlled by my very desires and passions. And so the idea here is that God understands his thoughts, and he has a penetrating knowledge and even understanding of why it is that we do what we do and think what we think and feel what we feel. And so the phrase in a more literal sense could be translated this way: "And you discern my strivings." That is to say, he's able to parse out and even interpret those inward groanings and passions that we might have, both good or evil. He's able to separate that which is inseparable and discern that which is undiscernible. Verse 3, you scrutinize, literally you sift out and winnow through with a fork my path and my lying down, that is when I'm in private, and are intimately acquainted with all of my ways, speaking here of his public life. And so whether in the privacy of your own home or out in public, like the workplace or the grocery store, the reality is that God is there. He is there and he is discerning and scrutinizing your path. In fact, it's the picture here of a person winnowing through or sifting out the grain on the threshing floor. He separates that which is worthless from that which is valuable. And so the reality then is that what might just seem rather neutral to us in just sort of everyday life, the point is that God is still there and he's there and discerning. That is, he's separating, he's interpreting every act and every aspect of your life. He knows the motivations, he understands the intentions, especially the things that seem to be hidden from our sight and from our minds. Verse 4, even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, Yahweh, you know it all. In other words, he understands that God knows all things, but notice, he knows them before they're even going to happen. In other words, it's not like God sees all things, but then he has to just sort of wait until they happen. Rather, the point is that God is aware of all things, both public and private, mental and physical, in the heart and out of the mouth, but before they even happen. In other words, this is just David's way of attributing absolute omniscience in all things to God. And so despite the fact that we often feel independent and feel like we have a sort of autonomous existence, the reality is that God knows everything about you. He knows what you're thinking, he knows what you're going to say, he knows what you're going to do, but before it's even a reality. And so he's expressing the fact here that nothing slips by and that nothing's out of God's sight. He knows every reality, he knows the why of every reality, and he knows every reality before it even is a reality. And so there is just full and complete exposure on the basis of having been searched out and known by God, but before the ages began. And so in light of that truth, in verses 5 and 6, he just sort of bursts out with this conclusion in light of some of those thoughts. And so he just states here in verse 5, you have enclosed me behind and before, and you have laid your hand upon me. Now, this isn't a picture of God laying his hand down as some kind of blessing or protection, but it's actually the Hebrew term here for palm. And so it's actually speaking of the idea that God cups his hand over your life and in the totality of your existence in the same way that a person will sort of cup their hand over a bug on the table. You're completely enclosed. You are, as one commentator put it, besieged by God. And so while it is true that God is a God who protects and provides and gives us everything that we might need as a beloved son or daughter, the immediate context here is speaking about the reality of there being no escape from being fully known and fully seen and completely scrutinized, not only from the front, not only from the back, but all sides, means this is actually a frightening reality for David. That in the midst of being king and called God's anointed, and even being considered a man after God's very own heart, that even just a marginal meditation on the reality of existing under the all-seeing eye of a holy and just God becomes a troublesome reality. And so in verse 6, he just concludes here with these words. He just says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. Literally, it's full of wonder and mystery. It's incomprehensible. And it's too high that I cannot attain to it. I think one of the difficult parts of theology is that it can just sometimes remain sort of intellectual, can't it? And so while it's not all that hard to understand certain truths of Scripture, and and even comprehend the intellectual ideas about who God is and what he's like, I think the challenge comes of not always being able to settle some of those things down into our own hearts. It's sometimes difficult to live with a constant awareness that God, at least in this case, is all-knowing. That he's always there, that he's always examining, that he's always present, even when we forget that he's present. And not just in an outward or a physical sense, but that he's in the consistent state of actually discerning your thoughts and knowing your intentions, and even in this very moment. He is discerning your thoughts as you think about the fact that he knows and discerns your thoughts. And now he's judging what you think about that. But David here was a man who had this incredible ability to take all that he knew and all that he understood God to be and let it move past his mind and let it rest into the very depths of his soul. And so as he does this, his heart not only becomes troubled, but he also starts to realize in a very realistic way the infinite reality that is his God. That he can't actually understand his fullness or comprehend the vastness. That he is truly a small and yet fully known and fully exposed speck under the micro-seeing eye of an infinite and holy creator. And so he just responds here with what almost feels like, to me at least, a song of concession. That he just relents and sort of yields to what seems to be an overwhelming reality. This is a description of a man who seriously considered the implications of what it means to be a creature living in the Creator's world. In fact, it almost models what we see happening to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 when he sees that vision of God as king, lofty and exalted. And the immediate response of Isaiah there was to just fall on his face as he declared a verdict of self-guilt before a holy and righteous God. And so David here, just reflecting on who God is and then who he is, and in light of who God is, simply yields to the recognition that God is big. He yields to the reality of what an infinite God must know and then understand of who he is, of even those things for which he doesn't even know about himself. And so he just confesses that this knowledge of God and all of its infinitude is this matter for which he simply cannot comprehend. And so in verses 7 through 12, he just states, in light of that reality, so where then can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. And even if I spread out my bed and shield, behold, you are there. In other words, whether you're in heaven or in hell, God is present. That heaven's not about you and hell's not where the party is, but it's the place where God is in his judgment. Everything that is about God. He is the creator, he is the sustainer, he's designed all things, he knows all things, and there's no place from which any of us can escape his scrutiny, but especially to the point of David here, in death. In fact, it's in death in which you'll never be more face to face with him. And he will be absolute reality. But then notice what David does here, starting in verse 9, but specifically into verse 10. Just being a man after God's own heart and one who's truly tasted of the Lord and known that he is good, he just begins to change his tone. And so while God is a God who is not to be trifled with and one that is to be feared, David here is still known in some of the most profound of ways, his goodness. He's known the mercy and the protection of God. And so he states in verse 9, if I take the wings of dawn, and if I dwell in even the remotest parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. Now, this word here for hand is actually a completely different term than we saw up in verse 5. And so it's not that term used to speak of his palm or that reality of how God encloses in on a person, but rather it's It's in the Hebrew his yad, his hand of protection. It speaks of his power and his might and his leadership, and always in the context of his goodness and his mercy. And so the phrase, the wings of dawn here, is simply a reference to how the sun will rise in the east, but then race toward the west. And so his point is that even if you could travel the globe at the speed of light and be surrounded by many things, there's God. He was there before you arrived. He'll remain there after you leave. But in the midst of all of that movement, he is still this ever-present reality by you. And even if you find yourself, as he says, in the remotest parts of the sea, where sea here represents chaos and darkness and even a kind of loneliness where no one is and nobody understands, there is God. He is present and abiding, and he possesses the fullness of knowledge. Perhaps there have been times in your life where you have been, or perhaps right now feel so incredibly alone. Or maybe you've received some news where while the room was filled with family and friends, in that moment, no one could quite feel the gravity of what you were feeling. And so the room just sort of faded. You had that experience perhaps of what he describes here in verse 11 of being without hope. But where he just says that surely the darkness overwhelms me and the light around me is like night. And this isn't speaking here of a literal darkness or a literal night, but it's a reference to some of those darkest nights of the soul. And this is some of those times when even in the midst of knowing truth and knowing who God is and understanding righteousness from unrighteousness and maybe what it is that God would have you do, that there's just something that for whatever reason won't let you see the light. Maybe it's the pressures of life. Maybe it's the realities of an uncontrollable circumstance. Sometimes, maybe you don't even know what's wrong. Sometimes you just feel alone and listless. And so there's a kind of apathy or maybe even frustration in the midst of all that you know to be good and all that you know to be nothing but pure, undeserved grace, but for whatever reason, you're still surrounded in what seems to be absolute darkness. Well, it's in that kind of moment that David here, in the darkest nights of the soul, just casts himself onto the discipline of preaching to himself. Of preaching to himself so that he might reflect on that which is true and good. Of reminding himself, maybe even in the midst of his own guilt, not of what he should have done, but maybe even running to some kind of release or running to some kind of therapy to numb the darkness, but simply casting himself onto the nature and the character of who God is. Of preaching to himself the reality of what he already knows to be true. There are no 12-step programs for David. There's no psychological techniques for sort of pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. There is only one thing and one thing alone, and that's getting his eyes off of himself and off of his situation and onto the nature and the character and the promises of who God is. Of a God whom he knows his situation. He knows what David's feeling. He knows what David's thinking. He knows the struggle. He knows the emotion. He knows the temptation to stop believing. And so what he does is he just reminds himself of the God who is there. And so in verse 11, he just preaches to his own soul these very words. He just says that even there, that is in the midst of the darkness and the chaos, your hand will lead me. And your right hand will lay hold of me, where the right hand of God is always a reference to his strength and his salvation. And notice, it's not David here having to try and find God's hand or discern his leading or try and discover his presence, but rather that God's the one who reaches out and in his goodness lays hold of him. And so how is it that David can actually have that kind of confidence? Well, notice it's not because he's just sort of blindly hoping that God will be there, but because he actually has a knowledge of the kind of God that he's dealing with. And so notice verse 12, he states, even the darkness is not dark to you. And the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. And so in the midst of difficulty, notice what David's technique is. It is nothing less than preaching to himself doctrine. It's reflecting on theology. In fact, this is why doctrine matters. This is why theology, a rich and right and robust theology, matters. He's not playing intellectual games. This is dealing with the matter of the heart and therefore matters of eternity. And so if you have a wrong view or even a shallow view of who God is, or if all you have is this sort of sentimental notion where God functions more like an imaginary friend or some kind of invisible or fictitious comfort, then you will not have what it takes to sustain your soul when your dark night comes for you. And so David here, just having this rich and full and rounded out understanding of the nature and the character of who God is, he has this ability to call to mind the arsenal of what it is and the way it is that God works on behalf of those whom he loves. And so knowing that darkness and the light are both alike to the God who creates and sustains both realities, he just reminds himself here that God is the kind of God who both leads and lays hold of those with a weary soul. In fact, there's an enormous amount of imagery here and promise and even gracious reality that's bound up with this idea here of God's right hand. And so while I don't have the time to trace it out for us, suffice it to say that just with one little phrase in the Hebrew here, a whole host of comfort is pouring forth into the very soul of David as he reminds himself of the grace and the mercy of an omniscient creator. A creator who knows and is actually there to sustain when nothing else is. He is acquainted with your soul. Now, he takes personal interest, not in light of what he doesn't know about you, but in the midst of knowing everything about you, of knowing your unbelief, of knowing your misplaced faith, of knowing all of our tendencies to just want to run and hide and just turn to finite comforts. But he's a God who knows. He knows who you are, and he's there. And so just in light of that reflection, notice what he does here starting in verse 13. In light of knowing who God is and then who he is in the light of who God is, he then gives a reason for why he knows that God will sustain him. And so notice what he says here beginning in verse 13. He states, for you formed my inward parts, which is just a Hebrew term speaking of the most vital organs of a person. So it's actually a reference to the soul. And you wove me in my mother's womb. That's speaking of the body and therefore the physical realities. And so he just has in mind here both body and the soul, which is just a reference to the totality of a person. And so his confidence in here in God to sustain him in whatever the situation is actually coming from a knowledge of the fact that God creates and sustains from nothing. He brought your soul into being and wove your very body into existence. You're a creation of his thoughts and a product of his desire. And so the reality is that your personality and your body type and your interests and your humor and your talents and your family, in other words, just the totality of who you are and what you are all the singular product of a creating God who at some point in history had a desire to craft and weave you together. And so the meaning here is that since you're a creation of God who is wrought about by the creation of his imagination, the reality is that he actually cares for you and your soul and your body and your circumstance even more than you do. There's not one situation or one event or even one rogue cell in your body that God's not allowed to come into being, or more accurately is determined to be, apart from his knowledge and his will and his divine omniscient permission. And so just knowing that to be the case and understanding what he is before his creator, he just cries out here in verse 14 with a kind of praise that almost reads like a song. And so he just states, so I will give you thanks. Why? For I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it well. My frame, speaking here of weakness, literally this bony little structure, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth, for your eyes have seen my unformed substance. This is just speaking about the fact that God knew you and had plans for you and crafted his design for you before you even were. And so within the context here, it's essentially an argument from the lesser to the greater. He's just saying that if God knew your frame and crafted your substance and made both your body and soul with a kind of infinite wonder, then how much more with the circumstances that he's decided to place you in? In fact, he goes on to state here in the second half of verse 16, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. In other words, all the realities of your life, whether good, pleasurable, or difficult, are nothing less than the result of God's divine design from eternity past. And so the fact that they've been written here in this book is just David's way of saying that nothing somehow surprises God, as if he can't somehow see your situation coming, but that he's actually the author of that situation. And so being the divine, omniscient, or an all-powerful author here, nothing can actually deter what comes for you. It's been written, it's been established, it's been determined before the ages began, and it's the design of God. And so every single trial, and every moment of suffering, and every kind of hardship, and even all those good things that might come to you, the reality is they were planned and purposed before you were and before your substance was even formed. And so David here, knowing that he was wrought forth by the design of God, just responds here in verse 15 by saying, so how precious are your thoughts to me, literally your intentions toward me. In fact, this is the same word that we see up in verse 2, that God knows our thoughts, or better, our very intentions. And so he just says, so how precious are your thoughts or your intentions toward me, O God. And how vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. This is just a confession that whatever he thinks God might think of him, God's thoughts and intentions are actually far more profound. That his intentions toward his people are actually far more caring and far more intimate than we can even recognize. Even when it comes to the difficult things, David says that God's far more concerned than even David is. And why is that? Well, because this whole reflection here of David's been all about the fact that his very existence is something which belongs to God far more than it even belongs to David. David didn't design the reality known as David. David doesn't sustain his own existence. He doesn't control the days and the events of his life, but he knows that God does. He knows that this reality and this creation called David was God's idea. And so everything that he experiences was therefore God's idea. And so the simple reality of your life and mine is that everything we are and all that we experience, especially the difficult things, which is actually the reason for why David's even writing, isn't because God has somehow abandoned us, but because he's intimately involved and cares for his creation far more than this creation could ever care for itself, especially when it comes to those who are his. And so he just says here at the end of verse 18, when I awake, I am still with you. I think one of the most difficult things to do when it comes to the idea of doctrine and theology and just sort of meditating on the person and the character of who God is and what his promises are is that there's this moment where you still have to get up and just sort of go back to life, isn't there? Which is actually what he means here by this idea of awake. He's not talking about waking up from sleep or something like that, but actually from arising from these meditations on the person of God. And I think it's incredibly easy to just study the word and read a book or even listen to a sermon and have your mind and your affection sort of lifted to some higher place of thought. But then there's this reality called life. And so it can sometimes be difficult to sort of translate those thoughts into a way that informs the everyday life. And so it can just feel like God isn't there, or that he's only there when you sort of have these conscious thoughts of him. But notice how David phrases this here. He doesn't say that when I awake, I feel your presence, or when I awake, I can sense that you are there, but rather he says that when I awake, I am in fact and in reality still with you. In other words, you're not with me, but I'm with you. You protect me, you keep me, you sustain me. In other words, the reality of living in light of an omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent creator has absolutely nothing to do with your circumstance or what you might feel in every given moment, but everything to do with truth. And the discipline of being able to preach that truth to yourself in the midst of those circumstances. And so this is exactly what he's doing. He's preaching to himself. He's resolving the reality in his own mind and heart of what is absolute. And so after his reflection here, or in our case, when we leave church and just go to lunch, will you walk out with a resolution in your mind that he is there, that he sees you and knows you, that he's aware of your frame and understands, having taken on flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, that he knows what it means to be but dust, that he sees your situation, and that in the midst of whatever it is, whether it be good or bad, there he is present, but as your sustaining reality. And he's sustaining you, he is, but not through some kind of felt need or even some therapeutic reality, but having just reminded you of his very own nature and character. David was in the midst of some incredibly difficult things. He had fear, he had frustration, he had, as we'll see in verse 23, some incredible anxiety. But it was in the midst of that moment that he casts himself here onto the reality of who God is, his creator and sustainer. And that while there might be moments in life where you're not consciously remembering that God is there, the reality is that you're still with him. You're being protected, you're being sustained, you are untouchable, whatever the circumstance, until his ordained hour comes for you. And so in light of these thoughts, in verses 19 through 22, he then returns to his own situation. That is, he turns to the occasion for which he is giving these reflections. And so for David as king and as God's very own anointed, who is in the consistent state, it seemed, of always being surrounded and always having his walls besieged by the enemy, and probably at night, which means his reference to darkness up in verse 11 is perhaps a double reference. And having just reminded himself in verse 5 that he's actually surrounded by God and enclosed by his presence, he calls here onto the justice of God and the righteousness of God as he awakens himself, verse 18, to go out into the world and fulfill his duty as king. In other words, he's going to go out and face his trial. And so armed with the character of God, he just states this in verse 19, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed." Why? Well, notice, "For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. And do I not hate those who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost of hatred." Why? "For they have become my enemies." Now, this is what is known in a technical sense as an imprecatory prayer. And it's the kind of prayer where you pray for the destruction, but more specifically for the righteous judgment of a person or a people. And so David here, being known as a man after God's very own heart, just says some things that don't sound very gracious. And the reason he can do that is because he's lined up their wickedness up and against the holiness of God, and he's found them with guilt. And so here he is pleading with God to destroy that which is vile. They're mockers and scoffers. They speak with arrogance. They act in wickedness. Notice they're men of bloodshed. They're said to be ones who speak against God, that is, they oppose him. They're men who take his name in vain, that is, there are people who refuse to reverence him. And so they dismiss him and ignore him and think unimpressive thoughts of him. And they're not believing, in other words, all these things that David just said to be true about him. And so David here, with incredible passion, prays for God's judgment. And this isn't a personal issue of David. It's not like this is personal vengeance or something like that, but it's a kind of attitude that results from seeing the righteous reality of who God is. And so the point to understand here is that the more that you begin to know God and then understand God and actually be conformed into the very image of God, then the more that your heart will actually begin to despise and hate that which God hates and then love that which God loves. In fact, this is why when a person comes to faith, there's just certain things that used to bring joy into their heart that just no longer rejoice their heart. And at the same time, as some of you might know who have perhaps come to faith a little bit later in life, there were these things that once bored you and felt like a burden and seemed like a cold, dead religion, and all of a sudden they're these defining realities for you. And so you find yourself saying certain things and doing certain things and even defending certain things. And why is that? Well, because your heart is now beginning to align with the will and the desire of God. You're beginning to love what he loves and abhor what he abhors. But even in light of that reality, just notice the maturity of David here. Instead of just keeping his eyes cast out onto the wickedness of everyone around him, which is actually his very trial as a king who needs to defend his nation, notice where his prayer takes him. And so he acknowledges the wickedness, he sees the evil, he calls out the sin for what it is and desires a righteous judgment, but then shifts the focus of God's holiness and righteousness, notice, onto himself. And so he just states here in verse 23, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me," that is, test me and examine me and put me through the fire. Why? To know my anxious thoughts. In other words, after reflecting on the omniscience of God, which is just this reality of God in which he knows all things in the most intimate of ways, he actually pleads with God here to employ the fullness of that attribute, and notice, not to expose the wickedness of those around him, but in the first place to search his own heart. That is, that through this trial of the besieging enemy, to expose him for what he is in ways that he don't even know exist. This is incredible maturity. But when's the last time that you prayed for a trial and a testing and a personal examination on the part of God so that he might bring to the surface all that still remains in you of wickedness? Who in this room can say that they're a man or a woman who's so much after holiness and so much a thing that drives you that you actually pray down trial just so that you can begin to see all that isn't yet righteous in you? I was talking to my wife about this psalm earlier this week, and she asked me the question of why it was that David was considered to be a man after God's own heart. What were the things that he was doing? What are the things that he did that God caused God to sort of label him with this reality? And I think my response was something along the lines of the fact that he believed God or something like that. That as you think about Goliath and Saul and all the foreign armies that were constantly his reality, these constant pressures, these constant threats on his life, and yet in the midst of all of those things, he still believed the promises of God. He was a man of incredible faith, which, to be honest, seemed like a reasonable answer until I read this verse. David was a kind of man who just at the end of the day had a kind of holy lust for holiness. He so much wanted to be conformed into the image and the character of who God is that he prayed for the fullness of God's omniscient knowledge to rip through his life so that he might bring to the surface for David all that he was. Examine me, that is, test me, and know my anxious thoughts, see the sin, expose the sin, test the sin. Why? So that holiness might be a reality. And so in verse 24, he just closes out this psalm by saying, so once again calling on to the omniscience of God. So see if there be any hurtful or wicked and lawless way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. And so for David here to be seen by God, that is to be known and exposed and be understood for the reality of what he truly was, is actually, according to David, to be led by God. And so to be seen and then exposed is the prerequisite to being led. Being led into what? Well, being led into the everlasting way. And so the everlasting way here just speaks of that which defines the very life of who God is. It speaks of his holiness and his righteousness and his purity, the way that is full, that way that is right, the way that conforms to the character and the image of God's very own person. And so the pathway to holiness often means the presence of difficult exposure and even a genuine wrestling with the reality of who we really are. It requires on this side of the cross to look at the person of Jesus Christ, the absolute manifestation of holiness. It requires us not to compare ourselves to others or just find people that are worse off than we are. That would have been incredibly easy for David here, but come to grips with the fact that the everlasting way is a way of unattainable perfection. It's a way that nobody in this room, doesn't matter who you are, nobody in the history of the world can attain it. Quite simply, the pathway to holiness is to recognize that our righteousness, that is our right standing before an infinite and holy and omniscient and omnipotent creator, is found only in the person of Jesus Christ, the very God-man himself. The one who took on flesh to do what we in our flesh can't. And so if you're a person here this morning still wondering and wrestling or confused or maybe just resisting, then the answer for life and the solution to the problem of your sin as mine is by looking to the one who, in spite of knowing us in the most intimate of ways for all that we are and all that we don't even know that we are, has chosen to know us in a radically different way through the death and the resurrection of his Son. And not as hostile enemies, but as it says in the Gospels, as his own beloved son or daughter with whom he is well pleased. And so what I think that at the end of this psalm is designed to do is to sort of bring us to a point that just begins with a confession. It begins with a confession, as David says here, that he is not what he ought to be. And so he pleads with God to expose him, that is to bring to the surface of first what he is, but secondly, what it is that he needs, the everlasting way. And so on this side of the cross, it is on this side of history, on this side of Jesus coming and dying and rising, what's absolutely clear is that none of us contain a right standing before God apart from simply trusting in what Christ has perfectly accomplished on our behalf. And so no matter who you are or what you've done, or even in light of what you'll never let anybody know about you, the simple reality of the scriptures is that all of us live our days before the eyes of an all-seeing and all-knowing and all-present creator who is holy and just and righteous and demands perfect obedience, but knows that we are but dust, that we are finite and sinful and weary and live in a broken world, and that all of us so desperately need to be known, but known in a way that brings life. And so the good news of the gospel is that the God of this universe, that is the creator and the sustainer of both your body and soul and his infinite love, has purposed to rescue us. He has purposed to ransom us and redeem us from his judgment and even from ourselves so that we might know a true and everlasting way. And so he calls all of us this morning knowing who we are and even seeing what we are in the midst of a lost and a dying world, to cast our eyes unto Jesus Christ, the one whom, as Psalm 16 states, sits at the right hand of the Father, where there are pleasures forevermore. And so my hope and my prayer for all of us this morning, because time is way past, is that we might cease from striving and find a kind of rest in him for both our salvation and our comfort.